And all of that intro, and here we are live with Liz Scott Smith here, live on Amazon, and we're going to be talking with Liz about a lot of book stuff because this is the author interview series. Liz has written a lot of books. She's helped people write a lot of books, and we have just a few of them in the carousel, which we've highlighted Western Legends. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Scott, how are you doing today?
I am good. How is
Good.
your
Thanks for
world?
having me.
And tell everyone about what's going on in Liz's world, where you're at, and
I'm in Dallas, Texas, and so I am a author, publisher, producer of events and podcasts, things like that, newsletters, magazine, a few other things related to publishing. Because publishing today is not just about books
mm-hmm.
anymore. There are all these other communication or media opportunities that exist, like what we're doing right now.
Yep.
This didn't exist when I started years ago. So I'm a self-publisher. I started self-publishing in 1992, and I had one of the first stores on Amazon. And then my mother had a Christian bookstore, so I grew up reading. I was a reader, but I wasn't always a writer. I always read from a young age.
Mm.
Library was my favorite place. I went to college, started out as a Spanish major, and got into conversation classes and stumbled around. And said, well, maybe I'll try something else. So I said, well, let me go over this PR stuff. I'm good with people, and, not understanding that that's a writing,
Mm.
career,
Mm-hmm.
that mostly, PR is all about writing. And so anyway, but they didn't have it at Stephen F. Austin, which is a state university in Texas. They only had journalism, speech, and radio, television. And if I'd have been smart, I'd done that radio, television. But of course, I didn't. Of course, I went journalism and speech, which of course is journalism. There's no money in, so but. But anyway, that's how I got to writing, because I worked on the school
Yeah.
newspaper for 3 years, and then I got out and I was in communication, and and that's how I kind of did my first stuff. So
But writing. I mean, you talk about journalism. There's no money, but my daughter, she writes well,
uh-huh.
but she thought that if you took like English or something in college, that you would have to be an English teacher.
Right.
And I told her, every time you open up a web page, somebody wrote that.
Right.
Every time you pick up a package, you look at at anything that you buy, somebody had to write that. That doesn't just happen.
Right. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
it's a pretty good skill.
Right. And just in communication in general, whether that's written communication or oral communication, really the top two skills that you can have. And if you do that, you can really pretty much be successful, probably in any business, and especially entrepreneurship or communication related.
Well, I'm interested in this because you started, you grew up in the book business, right? You grew up surrounded by books.
Right. Yeah.
And then you got
It was
involved with.
really interesting, because I didn't realize until basically about 6 months ago, when I was on a call with a guy, and he just said, well, how long you been publishing, Liz? And I said, oh, it's been in a long time. And he said, well, you must have started when you were young. He was trying to be nice about my age. And I was like, well, I mean, it was like, you don't realize. And then the light bulb came on, the aha moment hit you. And I went, God, I really have been in it since I was 11, because my mother and dad opened a Christian bookstore when I was 11 in 1972. And so for 20 years before I self-published my own book, I was around the book business. So I understand the retail part of the business, which most people don't have any experience with, most writers.
Sure.
We had all the big publishers back then, because back then they had those huge catalogs, that were this thick, and they had a list of all the books, and you'd go in and look it up and call them on the phone, or then later on you faxed them, what you wanted. They had an order sheet that you checked off. I want 2 of this, or 4 of this, or 7 of that. And my job was to catalog those things and put them back in alphabetical order, on the weekends when I go to school during the week, but I come up on Saturday to help. And so mostly I sat over in the children's corner and read books, but but I had access. So there's nothing, nothing better. And that's that's a really key thing too, and that's why it's so important today, especially with, you know, disadvantaged communities.
Mm.
If you don't have access, it really can be a stumbling block for you. There are so many things that we take for granted. You're living in a different country. I mean, we're on Amazon Live. They've got people all over the world. So
Yep.
there are going to be people watching this in other countries, and they may not have access to books or a library or a bookstore.
Well, it's one of the things I know. I mean, I like the physical books, right? They're kind of
Right.
fun. I like the, but they do take up a lot of space. And the
Right.
more
Hold
you
them and
read,
touch them.
and so a couple years ago, I still do a mix between Kindle books
Uh-huh.
and physical books.
Right.
But
Me
what's
too.
one of the nice things is because I've got the Kindle reader on my tablet and I've got it on the phone. You can, you know,
Right.
but anywhere I go, that library of Kindle is with me.
Right. Yeah. And that's huge, so the same thing for me. I mean, I like to feel it, touch it, and hold it in my hand. And when I read at night, I usually read, a book if I've got one. I mean, I
Mhm.
nowadays kind of half and half, because I was telling you earlier, I recently moved, and it was like, well, what do you want to take? And I said, the books. And they're like, we can't take all these books, Liz. You got to do something with these books. We can't take all these books.
Yep.
So, I mean, we took boxes to, like, we have a place called Half Price Books where you can turn in books. And so,
Mhm.
I mean, for like 3 weeks, I took, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 boxes, 3 or 4 times a week, and turned them in, and got 10 cents on the dollar, but at least they're going back in the system. I mean,
Right.
somebody
Yeah.
might come along and find that book on their shelf and take it home and be glad they read it. And
Yep.
I'm glad for them to have it rather than just throw it in the trash. So it's really hard for me to
Absolutely.
throw books away.
I'm with you too. It's interesting though with the Kindle because I was just on a trip down in Nashville,
Uh-huh.
and as I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, uh, I was sharing something about a book, and I was able then to just take my phone, open it up, search, go right to that passage,
Right.
and not just go, well, it was something about the author was saying something like that. It was actually I could read
Right.
the author's words,
Yeah.
so much more impactful.
Right. Right. For sure. For sure. So I'm a Kindle person too. And obviously when you travel, I used to take, a separate bag with my books, and now I don't have to.
Right, that's
So,
right.
and especially now that you have to check baggage and pay for that baggage. You used to take 2 or 3 bags, but now you got to pay for anything over 1 or 2, I think. So,
Boy, I tell you, yep, it adds
but
up.
anyway, yeah, makes it different. And then, obviously the ebooks, I mean, a huge difference
Mhm,
came into the market, and that's about the time I started helping other people, because I
mm,
basically wrote my first book as a creative writing class. So you can start anywhere. I took a creative writing class with my mother for fun once I got out of college at the local junior college. And, the instructor said one of the stories that I read, we had to go in and meet, once a quarter or during the semester with the instructor. And she said, I think you could sell this as a children's book. And, I was just stunned because it was the most uncomfortable piece that I'd written, and I'd
mm,
written it like 2 days before, like the night before, one of those kind of
yeah,
things, up all night kind of thing. And so I was really kind of stunned. But another key thing, if you're listening and taking notes, is if you're uncomfortable with it, it's probably better than you think it is,
mm, yeah,
and that was a lesson I learned early on from this writing instructor. And I'm ashamed to tell you, I don't even know or remember her name today, but that was a key thing. And so back then you had to send it out 50, I sent it out to
mm,
50 publishers. I knew how to go to the library and get the Writer's Digest book that had all the publishers. And then you had to go in and check and see who did children's books, and you had to send them a query letter and or a copy of your manuscript. And I had just a copy, the text. I didn't have the illustrations or the pictures. I had just written the story. And
mhm,
so, I sent that off to my 50, and I waited and I waited and I waited. And traditional publishing is still exists, but it's still like that. You wait
mhm,
and you wait and you wait, or now you got to send to an agent, and even back
right,
then you had to send to an agent, but today it's even more important. because there's just too many people in the marketplace, you know. And so
Yeah.
I got back 47 rejections. You know, it's like being stabbed in the heart. You're like, oh my God, 47. But, you know, just enough, one or two
Hmm.
that said, oh, it's different. We kind of like it. We're not buying anything in this year. We've already bought everything we're going to buy. But, you know, and then even one of them said, if you self publish, maybe we'll put it in your catalog. Because self publishing didn't really exist very much then either. It was just
Okay.
starting
Yeah.
come around. And so, you know, I did like most people do. I said, well, I guess that book dream's not for me. I put it away. You know, I put it in the desk drawer and shut the door and said, well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, and jumped into entrepreneurship, started an ad agency, a creative services firm here in Dallas, and you know, and did my thing there. But as most things happen, you know, it comes back around. Timing
Yeah.
is everything. And my one of my clients was the African American Museum, which we'll talk a little bit later about the book when we get to talking about
Yeah.
the book. That's kind of how I got involved with that. But they said, "Well, you've got a children's book, don't you?" And I said, "Well, I've got a manuscript. You know, I had a manuscript. I didn't have a book.
Hmm.
So, but what I did have is I was 5 years into my business, so I had cash flow. I had a printer because I was doing print collateral materials. I had an
Hmm.
artist, a designer who was designing, you know, basically business stuff like logos and brochures and things. And so I went to him and I said, "Hey, you know, I've got this children's book. Could you do anything? You know, could you draw some images for me?" And he said, "Well, yeah.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, you know, I did a couple of children's books for some other people a few years ago."
Wow.
So I was like, "Wow, okay." So you know, so I gave him, you know, I told him what I wanted. And the bad news is he's an artist. And so he didn't really read the copy. So, you know, he just listened to what I told him and he drew from that. And so I've kind of got what's called an advanced reader for years because, you know, basically, um, you know,
I'm
the
gonna
pictures are
I'm gonna
real.
highlight this one. I'm gonna highlight this in the carousel creative
Yeah. So,
monster.
so so the stories, you know, the images are real simple, but the language is a little bit higher level because it
Mm.
does talk about the cerebellum, which is the brain. This is the story
Hmm.
about how your brain works creatively. And so I wanted the scientific and the, you know, and the brain information to be correct. And so,
Yeah.
and I wanted kids to have to look the word up. You know, I wanted them to go to mom and dad and say, what does this mean? Or I don't
Mm.
recognize this. I don't know what this word is, or I don't know what this says, so that they would read together.
Right.
But, you know, and I went and printed 2,500 copies, sold my first 100 copies and said, yeehaw, yeah, I'm loving this book stuff. I'm going to do this, you know, and woke up about 2 days later and said, oh, God, I guess I'm going to have to sell these other 2,400 copies because, you know, back then you had to print a large quantity
Yep.
to get the price down so that you could make some money, you know, not really
Hmm.
kind of grasping the concept that, well, that's $8,000 or $10,000, you know, output.
Sure. Yeah.
But, you know, I had 5 or 6 other jobs in the print shop. So to me, it was just another job in the shop, you know, and I was paying the printer like every 30 days. You know, I got a bill from them. We paid down on whatever projects, you know, the 4 or 5 projects we had in the shop. So, you know, so it really wasn't until a little bit later on, you know, that I really got to grasp the whole, you know, investment
Yeah.
there.
Well,
But
it's interesting. And just to talk about the book for a moment too is having read a lot of books to my children over the years and reread those books,
yeah,
having something that is a little bit more advanced like this is wonderful because you know a lot of times the children's books are, I'll call it the equivalent of Chutes and Ladders as a
right,
game, right? I mean, it's just there's no substance there. There's nothing. It's
right,
just
yeah,
and but to have something that's a little bit more engaging for the adult, as well as
yeah.
maybe creating that opportunity to engage with your child. How wonderful is that?
Yeah, and well, and what's really another interesting thing is we ended up using it as a book for literacy because
Okay.
adults that couldn't read,
Yeah.
they were not intimidated by the book. It
Mm.
wasn't a, you know, it wasn't a book like this, you know, that
Yeah.
had, you know, more type and more reading and more whatever, you know. It was simple, it was big words, it was, you
Hmm.
know, And so they were much more comfortable, reading, starting and trying to learn and reading with something
Right.
like that. So, you do different things. Like I did put an advanced reader sticker, I had some stickers made and put those on it, and we sold it that way. And, and we sold the talented and gifted and spoke to talented and gifted. And, for some folks like that at the school districts, because the schools,
Hmm.
have that in all of their schools. And
Yep.
so,
And
you figure out ways.
that's wonderful because, one of those things is when you have talented students, keeping them
Right. Keeping them
connected,
engaged. Yeah.
right?
It's
Yeah, because
important.
it's
Mhm.
they're bored. They get bored,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
they can give up on their academic career because they're like, "Is this it?"
Right. Yeah. Because they're not challenged. And, and the teacher's trying to deal with 30 other kids, so trying to help that one or two that are way ahead, is sometimes a difficult challenge.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
so we were lucky,
every
you know.
time I meet a teacher, I always thank them for protecting our future.
Right, for taking kids on. Yeah, I mean, whoever thought up school was, I mean, we need to be down on our hands and knees thanking the Lord every day for those people that brought turned that
Hmm.
school line. Because,
You
I
got
don't
that
know how
right.
people get anything else done. And I know with this pandemic, I mean, I don't have kids. I'm single, never married. I've got nieces and nephews, and we had the nieces, the great nieces, because they were doing school by Zoom. So a couple
Oh
of,
yeah.
there were 2 or 3 weeks or 4 or 5 weeks where they were, spent the weekend with us, and they just stayed Monday and Tuesday because they were doing, they were on Zoom. They
Just
were
they're doing
doing
it online. Yeah, yeah.
they were doing
It's
online learning, and they've gone back now, but there's still a lot of, like you say, a lot of schools in Texas that aren't, and I
mhm.
think, especially kids that have, medical conditions or special needs and things like that. So
Yeah.
kind of
Well,
a
and I think it
two-way thing.
proved that we can do education a little bit different, and
Right.
also the face to
Yeah.
face is important. So it'll be
Right.
different from now on. We know that's one thing that we know for sure. It'll be a different
Yeah.
education process,
Right.
but I
Going
think it'll be
forward for
better in
sure.
the end.
Yeah, I think so. I think so because and good and bad, like you say. I mean, all things
Mhm.
change. I mean, it's just like this. So in '92, when I started, there was no internet. There was nothing. I mean, I had to learn how to sell those books. We
Mm.
sold a lot of books out of the back of the trunk, or like you say, you always carry them in the car with you. And you go in the store, or you drive by someplace, and you go, oh, well, maybe there's a children's clothing store. Maybe they'd sell the book. And you learn to go in and say, hey, yeah, I've got this gift item because they don't buy books. So that's the first thing you learn. You go in and say, I got this book. And they go, well, we don't buy books. And we're like, what do you mean you don't buy books? And well, we don't buy books. I said, okay. So, couple of times, 2 or 3 times down through that dance. And then you go, well, what do you buy? And they go, oh, well, we buy gift items. I was like, this is, so the next store you go in, you go, I've got a gift item. It'd be great for your store. Cause see, they got a line item in their form
Mm.
and their accounting, vendor or purchasing department, thing that says gift items, but they don't have a line item for books. So guess what? That means they can't buy books.
That is a smart tip right there.
I mean, so you learn these things as you go along. But yeah, so there you go. So that's secret number two is,
Yep.
figure out the language, and every distribution system's different. I mean, that's a bad
Hmm.
thing. I mean, the platforms are the same now. If you're doing online platform, they're the same.
Hmm.
But if you sell the military, that's one thing. If you're selling to libraries, that's a different thing. If you're selling to
Yeah, that's
colleges
right.
and universities, that's a different thing. If you're selling to
Yeah.
schools, because the same thing, they don't necessarily buy, the librarians buy books, but other departments don't necessarily buy books. But they bought
Right.
our books, okay, because we figured out how to talk to them in a
Hmm.
language that worked for them, where they could go back to their boss and say, hey, I want to buy 30 of this supplemental education materials to give to my talented and gifted class because we're studying the brain. And this is just another resource for
Hmm.
them, that will teach them something that that they're not getting, in our
Right.
regular curriculum kind
Interesting.
of
Yeah,
thing,
that's great.
you know?
And I want to go back to the early days because you mentioned
Uh-huh.
in '92, no internet, but then along came this online book selling platform,
Right.
Amazon.
Yeah.
And as you said, you were there really early on.
Yeah, I think 2004, 2005 when they actually started. I think they actually started rolling out 2004, but people didn't know who they were much. And then 2005, I think, was really when they kind of started to take off a little bit. So originally, what they let you do was they let bookstores have a store
Mm-hmm.
or have a shop. So if you had a retail outlet, like my mother,
Yeah.
even though she didn't really do that until we didn't do that until later, she had the potential to do that. But I was looking at it for myself, for the books I was writing and trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure it out. So I was on, and so I have a store that's called Writer Liz Lawless, or Liz Law, I think, Writer Liz Law. First store I ever had. Then later on, my dad did get sick a couple of years later, and we closed our store down. And so we had 3,000 or 4,000 pieces of inventory in boxes from the bookstore. And, we took those home, put them in the garage because we had to move,
Mm-hmm.
because we got a deal on our house. And so we had 30 days to get moved. And so we just moved a store and 2 houses at the same time and boxed them up. But a couple,
Wow.
I said, well, Mother, why don't we take some of these books and put them on Amazon? I said, go out there every day and get 10 books. And she was like, okay, I can do that. I showed her how to get on. So my mother's in her 70s and she's the online queen, and she became the book selling queen on Amazon. And I mean, the first 4 or 5 years, she made $10,000 or $15,000 in additional income off of
Mm-hmm.
inventory that was sitting in the garage,
That there was, wouldn't have sold
because
otherwise.
would have never sold it, or we'd have sold it for
Mm-hmm.
10 cents at a garage sale or something, maybe, or
Sure.
giving it away. But yeah, she was able to sell. And in those early days, they used to give you the email and the address and all that, because we were shipping ourselves. So we would get
Oh,
the
right.
order. Amazon would take the order. They would
Mm-hmm.
send us an email. You got to sell, and this book sold for this much money, and the shipping was this much, and it has to be shipped by so and so date. And and we would get the email too. Now
Mm-hmm.
they don't give you the email.
Yeah.
Because about 4 or 5 years in, they really began to realize the money's in the list.
There's some
And
value to that list. Yeah,
right.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I mean, they told you, don't put anything in the box, or don't be self promote. I mean, those were all the rules for
Mm-hmm.
participating, in their process. And you had to agree to certain terms and conditions, and that
Right.
was some of it. But that was a boon for my mother, who
Mm-hmm.
who had worked for herself all those years, and her Social Security was probably $300 or $400. And lucky my dad was a teacher, and she got my dad's Social Security, so
Mm-hmm.
she actually really lived off his, and then just played off. Hers was the go out to dinner or buy something nice for yourself this month, kind of thing. But
Nice.
but yeah, so it's been a real process to see. And that's the thing. I mean, today there are like 3 main ways to publish. Traditional publishing still exists, like we talked about. That's a much longer process, and you got to decide what you want. If you don't want any control, if you just want to sit and write and do your thing, which today that doesn't exist anymore, but because today you have to market. I mean, you
Right.
don't have to market as much, but what people think is they think traditional publishing is going to save their all and is the be all and end all. And I
Right.
can't, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it. Now, probably obviously because I've always self-published, but I did have a traditional contract at one time with a
Mm-hmm.
library publisher. Ended up that we broke the contract and didn't ever publish because the editor got fired. They got a new editor, and me and the new editor could never, we were always like talking at cross purposes. I was like, it's right
Mm.
brain. We need color. We need color on that page because this is about left and right brain thinking. And color happens in the right part of the brain. It happens all over, but I mean, and so it was like we were just like back and forth. And when my contract came up for renewal, I said, I can do this myself and not have
Right.
all these issues,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have complete control over this process. So that's what you got to decide. You got to decide, do you want to be in control, or are you willing to give up a lot of control? Because when you go
Right.
with a traditional publisher, they can change your title, they can change the name of your characters. I mean, once you sign an agreement with them, you agree to a lot of things, so you got to be really careful when you're reading the contracts and things.
Uh-huh.
There's still a few big, upfront payment but you got to have some influence. You've got to have some credibility,
Mm-hmm.
some professional or academic or whatever, chutzpah. And you gotta
Right.
you gotta already have your list. I mean, you're not gonna just go in there and have, well, no, I don't have a list, and no, I don't have anybody that I can sell. I can't sell any of these books. I expect you to do everything. It didn't happen 50 years ago, and it still doesn't happen today. But
Mm-hmm.
you can get a traditional contract. You're just looking at 18 months. It takes you a year to find an agent, another year for that agent to sell it, and then another year to print it. So, if you're lucky and you get an agent early, like in a couple of months,
Mm-hmm.
and then they sell it in a couple of months, maybe you can knock that down to 18 months. But I don't
Right.
know hardly anybody that has a traditional contract that's done it in less than 18 months, unless they're a
Wow.
regional publisher. Some regional publishers do publish faster, like 12 months,
Mm-hmm.
12 to 18 months.
Right.
Whereas if you want to self-publish, you could be up 90 days, 30 or 60 if you're not doing anything else.
Well, I often say this is the greatest time ever to be alive,
Right.
because
And to
if you
publish.
want to, if you have a story to tell, if
Yeah.
you want to write a book,
Yeah.
then the only barrier to entry is your willingness to participate.
Right. That's right. You're exactly right. So I do the same thing. I tell people it's the greatest time in the world to publish, and I still think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there are a lot of moving parts to publishing. It's not a simple, easy business. If it was, if it was quick and easy, everybody'd be doing it, and they're not. I mean, there are a lot of people doing it that weren't doing it in the past. There are a lot more people doing it now, and there are a lot of more tools available.
Right.
Platforms available, like you
Mm-hmm.
say. Amazon obviously first, and then the other guys got into the game. I mean, Ingram's
Sure.
always been the biggest wholesale distributor of books in the world, in the United States at least, and they ship all over the world. But they have 38,000 retail outlets or retailers. That's big box retailers. They print for all the big guys. For the most part, and they printed all Amazon stuff for years. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people don't know that, but but they've got in the game a few years ago with Ingram Spark, so they could
Mm-hmm.
compete. Barnes and Noble, they're trying to compete, so they kind of did two things. In the early days, they said, we got to do something else. What are we going to do? And they went after the college market. And so Barnes and Noble has 1,372 stores or 68 stores, whatever it is, but half of those stores are college bookstores. So they took over the bookstore on campus at a bunch of colleges, like at SMU, Southern Methodist, one of our big private schools here in Dallas. Barnes and Noble runs the textbook and the book part of the store.
Yeah.
And so that's how they were going to compete against Amazon. They were going to, open themselves up to another market, students, for instance, or professors and students and families, which they did, pretty well at. I mean, that kind of kept them going for a lot of these years, And then, of course, Apple's got in the game. Apple was the hardest for years, and they're still a little bit difficult. The thing about Ingram is you have an upfront cost, which Amazon doesn't charge you anything until you sell something, because they're a marketer. What people need to understand is Amazon's a marketing platform. I think they get it now. But when they were first in the book business, before they started selling all this other stuff, people thought they were a bookstore. They weren't a bookstore. They just went out and bought everybody that was, going out of business for 10 cents on the dollar. And
well,
then they
setting up the whole Amazon platform originally with books. Books store well. They don't, spoil or rot.
Right, exactly.
They're hard to damage.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of reasons why books made sense in the beginning.
Right.
To sell.
Yeah, no question.
And that's what I love about doing these author interviews live on Amazon is that it is kind of a back to the roots of Amazon.
Right.
But they've made it so easy today. So to be able to,
they really have, and it's getting easier, and they've got more tools like you and I talked about. I mean, obviously Kindle, I mean, with KDP, I mean, for years it was called Create Space. And what happened is they bought that company. That was a third-party company that they bought who did paperbacks and hardbacks. Okay. And then they could, basically you could publish through them, but you were publishing through a third-party company that they had basically taken over. Once they got it all kind of, and started moving in this bigger direction, and they got bigger and they grew and grew and grew, then they said, we want to move everything to our own platform. Obviously, that makes sense. That's a good business decision if you want to go at it from that play. It caused a lot of problems
Mhm.
for publishers and people trying to publish books. But for them, I mean, that was a smart move to kind of make everything more consistent.
So you go to kdp.amazon.com. I put that in the chat. You go to kdp.amazon.com. You set
Right.
up your account. You
Yeah.
download the Kindle Create program.
Right.
Take your Word document, insert it, do some formatting, and then add a cover. And they even give you can even make your cover right there on the
Right.
platform, and then you hit publish.
Right.
And now I remember back to an essay written by Andy Rooney, and you remember Andy Rooney.
Right. Sure.
He one time did one essay that showed his transition right from the manual typewriter to the
Right.
electric typewriter to a word processor
To the word
to a
processor.
computer.
Yeah.
And he said, computers don't make writing better; they just make it easier.
Right. Yeah. Well, and
So you
that's the
still
thing.
have
And
to
we
put
still
something out
do
good.
it the old fashioned way. We don't use the Kindle. The only thing we use Kindle for is to upload and sell and market. We
Mhm.
still do all the production ourselves and in house and do it ourselves and lay it out and thing it, because it doesn't always work. Okay. And the bad thing with Word is things move around in Word. So because Word
Mhm.
is not a solid platform. I mean, it's a database. I mean, it's a word processing platform.
Mhm.
But like you say, if I send a file to you and it converts in the transition, the photos may go from up here to down here, or 3 or photos climbed up together, so you always have to go back and check it page for page. You can't just load it and let it go and not proof it or not look at it. Now they give you the opportunity to do all of that,
Mhm.
which you should always do. But we do production and layout, and then we save as a PDF file, and then we load PDF files because they don't change.
Mhm.
Nothing's going to change in the transition and in the process, because it is, you're going from one kind of a platform or software to another software.
Mhm.
And and they're coming out with the new stuff all the time. I mean, obviously they when they switched over from Create Space to KDP, the bad thing is now you can't really talk to anybody. You used to could call and talk to somebody if you had an issue, a production issue, or you could
Right.
send an email, and
Yeah.
within 24 hours that problem got solved or handled, because they actually
Well,
had
that's
staff
yeah. There's
to do
always
that.
a trade-off, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
I can set up my account, I can download the tools, format my book, upload it, sell it,
Right.
and just give them my tax ID information, and the money comes to me. But I
Right.
didn't have to pay anything to do that.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's
you didn't have to
what's
pay up front. And
yeah.
and Ingram's not bad. I mean, it's only $49, but if you're new and you're starting out,
Mhm.
$49 may be $49, And
Well,
so
that's a tank of gas in today's world,
right. That's right. Or
or
a nice
or a
meal out
partial
or
tank of
whatever.
gas.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
it makes a
but
difference. It
it's
makes a
it's still
difference.
great, like you say. So whatever, regardless of the platform you like, I mean,
Mhm.
if you're an author, you want to be on all the platforms, because you don't know where your customer's at. And if
Right.
it doesn't cost
Yeah.
you anything, you need to be on Barnes Noble. If it doesn't cost you anything, you need to be on Kobo. If it doesn't really cost you anything, you need to be on Apple. Now, Apple, you used to have to pay a developer producer, fee of
Mhm.
$99 a year. They got rid of that because they're trying to compete. They
Yeah.
separated out the divisions. It used to all be under iTunes, and it was really hard to find books and magazines. You could find games and music easily
Mhm.
because that was their bread and butter. Now they've broken out all the divisions. So now you got iBooks, and you got iMagazine, you got iNews, or you got iGame, you go games and then tunes or music or whatever. So
That's
it's a
right.
lot easier now, and they're getting more books into the system, and they're making it easier. So their software is easier to use and to upload and to format than it used to be. And they're all over the world too, like
Yeah.
Amazon. So you certainly want to be in those
Absolutely.
markets, because you don't
You
know if
have to
your
be.
customer, your
Yep.
customer might be an Apple person like me. They may have an iPad and a desktop,
They make it easy, don't
two
they? They make it
phones,
easy.
and they're all Apple products. Well, if you got somebody that's a Raven fan,
Mhm.
you need to be on that platform. But, if you're used to, like you and I, you like the hard printed copy, you're used to going in the bookstore, and you're used to going in a
Mm.
Barnes and Noble and looking on the shelf and pulling them off and reading the back cover and looking through it because you want to, make an intelligent decision about how to spend your
Yeah,
money and what you're reading. Then you're going to go to Barnes and Noble and buy a nook. You're going to have a nook. Well, if you're not on that platform, that customer's not buying from you,
that's right. Yeah.
and so
Well, that's it. The key thing
you
in
got to think
sales has
about the
always
marketing
been
piece.
absolutely. It's always been be where your customers are. And
Right.
one of those things too that the self-publishing route has made it possible for people to actually get those traditional publishing contracts. I did an interview with Joe Sanic
Right.
last month, and he had just his book was releasing. Well, it was earlier this month. It was just releasing.
Hmm.
Thursday is the new Friday. He had published a number of books, self-published,
Right.
and but he did what you're talking about. He marketed them, he sold them, he
Right.
built an audience,
And
and
somebody
so
took
then he
notice.
was able to take his next idea and
Right.
go to a traditional publishing route.
Right. Right. And like you say, I've got nothing against traditional publishers. I have a lot of friends that only publish that way, and they're
Mhm.
lucky enough to do that. Most of my people are fiction related. I got a legal
Mhm.
thriller, I got a horror guy, and they always went that route. My horror guy, he had a big contract with Penguin. And he said he'd never do that again. He has a regional publisher now because he was just a number.
Mhm.
He was one of 100 authors for 1,000 authors for them, and there was no hands on. I mean, when they were publishing there was, but after it got published, that was it.
Yep.
And so now he's with a regional publisher that publishes horror, stuff. But he's one of the top 4 or 5 guys they got. He's probably the
Nice.
top guy they got, or he's the one or two because
Well.
he's the next Stephen King coming down the pipe. His name is Brian Moreland, and he's not new. He's been writing for 20 years. He's going to be one of those overnight successes.
Yep.
That's got the baby face, and you go, man, how did he write horror? That's pretty scary because he looks so unassuming.
Yep.
He's a nice, good-looking, young-looking kid, even though he's probably 50 because he's been writing for 20 years. And
Mhm.
he's got the 7, 8, 10 books, and but one of these days he'll break out,
Yeah.
just like your guy did. So,
Yeah.
and that's the
Makes a
thing. I mean,
difference.
what we tell the biggest mistakes people make, if we want to talk about mistakes, what do you want to talk about first? Is they don't know who their audience is. I mean,
Mm.
everybody I talk to, when I say, well, who's your audience? They say, my book's for everybody. Well, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm here to tell you that no, your book's not for everybody. And even if it was for everybody, you couldn't market it. You don't have enough money to market to
Mm.
everybody. So that's
That's
why you
right.
got to choose a market. That's why you got to choose
Mhm.
a primary audience and a secondary audience. Not saying you can't go and sell to somebody else, but you need to choose who that first person is, because a 30-year-old woman with 3 kids is not getting her information the same way a 50-year-old truck driver is.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're not. So they're not in the same place. They're not getting their information in the same way. So you can't just throw it out there and blast it. And that's what people think. Well, I'll just put it out there into everybody. And that's why they sell less than 250, 500 copies. 95% of people
Mhm.
only sell 250, 500. It's 500 now, I think, probably because of the platforms, the access and social media and stuff. It used to be 250. And that top 5% is who sells all of it. 5% of people make all the book sales, and the other 95% sell the 250 to 500 because of the marketing and because they don't know who their audience is. So the first thing
Mm.
we tell people is, before you start writing, figure out who your audience is, create that avatar. What's their age? What's their demographic? Do they live in the city? Do they live in the country? Do they live, internationally? Do they, do they have any kind of college degree or education or experience or knowledge in certain area or industry? Do they have kids? Do they not have kids? Do they have a certain income level? Do they not have certain?
Mhm.
Because all of that's going to matter when you start marketing, your book.
Sure.
And you're going to sell a lot more if you can target market. Because, like I say, it's really not the fact that somebody wouldn't be interested in your book. It's
Mhm.
about you don't have enough money to market. And no,
Yep.
Steve,
And
I don't have enough. You don't have enough. I mean, it's just the
it's
nature of the
true. That's true.
business, you know. I mean,
Yep.
until we, like you say, until we get the big contract or sell that 100,000. But even then, you know, like I say, I mean, all of the traditional people that I read,
Mhm.
they've all gone to self-publishing. Okay,
Hmm.
they're taking all their backlist and put them up, and they're self-publishing them because their traditional publishers aren't selling them anymore. They're only interested in the top, latest, greatest, the things that are coming out right now this year, unless it's, you know, I
Mhm.
mean, unless it's a president or Oprah or Dr. Oz or somebody. I mean, if you've got
Right.
somebody with a, you know, a million plus billion followers, you know, they're going to stay in the marketplace and they're going to stay on
Right.
the shelves a lot longer than, you know,
I
Liz from
always said
Dallas, Texas.
there you know, two ways to sell a million copies of your book, and one of them was to have Oprah hold it up and say, "Oh, I love this book," and the
Right.
other one was to
Right.
have Rush Limbaugh hold up your book and say, "I hate this book."
Right. That's it. That's it for sure. So,
Either way, you're set. But for the most part, um, yeah, you need to really narrow down on who your audience is. And John Lee Dumas, and I know you're a
right.
podcaster as well, and
Right.
so
Yep.
JLD, his book came out earlier this year,
Uh-huh.
which is the Common Path to Uncommon Success, right? I think that's the title is, and a lot of it he talks about his audience.
Right.
And so when he started his podcast, he didn't just define, as they call it, the avatar. He didn't just say, "Oh, it's a male between this age and that age with this income and
Mm-hmm.
whatever." He actually named that person.
Right.
And he says, you know, this person, whatever, Paul, uh,
Right.
is 27 years old, is married, has two young children, has
Mhm.
a 30-minute drive to commute work every day,
Dang. Right.
and I mean, he really,
Right. Yeah. And the more detail you get, mine's Shirley. And same
yeah,
thing,
okay,
like you say,
hmm,
you know, the more information you can give them and do, and then you write to that person because then it's more
yes,
personal. You talk to that person. What they, you know,
yes,
John's doing is he's talking to that listener, that podcast or that video person or
hmm,
whatever. I think his is an audio podcast in it, but he, you
hmm,
know, and that just makes it more intimate. That makes people feel like you're talking to them and
yes,
not
and
just everybody. Because the bad news is, you know, we've been bombarded so much by advertising. Our first, you know, our first response is, "Yay, let me buy that." I mean, that's not what we're saying in our brain. You know, in our brain, we're
right,
going, you know, well, this is for you. Well, no, it's just like, you know, first time home buyers. If you got a book about
mm,
first time home buyers, you know, what you need to say is first time home buyers for teachers. Okay.
hmm,
Because if you say first time home buyer and I'm a teacher and I'm a first time home buyer, I'm going to say, oh, well, that's probably not for me. That's everybody else. They're not talking about me, even though I'm looking about buying a house for the first time. You
yep,
know, we're saying all the negative reasons why that's not for us. But if it says straight out, first time home buyer for teachers, secret tips for
hmm,
teachers, if I'm a teacher, I'm going straight there. I'm going to at least pick it up and look at it, or I'm going to go online and I'm going to read the description, or I'm going to see
hmm,
if any of my other friends, teacher friends, know anything about it. Because I identified with that comment or
hmm.
like you say, so there
That's
are
right.
those key things, you
It
know, cover's
resonates.
important, title's
It
important,
resonates. Yeah.
subtitle's
Yeah.
important, you know,
Well,
shorter is better.
I was thinking about Tom Hanks was in the story about Fred Rogers, right? I
Right.
think it was
Yeah,
what's the name
Mr.
of the movie?
Rogers'
It's a
Neighborhood.
beautiful
He was
Mr.
from
Rogers'
Dallas.
Neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
And so this movie just came out, and there's a line in there. There's a scene in there, and I remember hearing Fred Rogers talk about this in an
Mhm.
interview years ago,
Yeah.
because they said, how can you be so successful talking to, you know, these millions of children? And he said, you know, I just look right into the camera and I imagine I'm talking to one child.
Yeah.
So he wasn't Fred Rogers knew this,
Right.
and he put it to
Learned
work.
it
He
early
said,
on. Yeah.
you can't talk to a million children, but I can talk to one child.
Right.
And if you can write a book, You can't write a book that's going to sell 100,000 copies or to 100,000 people, but
Right.
you can write a book for that one person.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, if one person reads it and says something nice, I mean, that's enough for us. We don't even care. I mean, for some of us that write, we don't even care if we never sell another book. I mean, we do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just
I
the
agree.
fact that if somebody comes up to you and say, you don't know how your book changed my life, or
Mm-hmm.
I'd never read that information before, how come I didn't know that? I mean, speaking of the book, and we'll talk about that. It's this Western Legends
Let's
book.
get into that. Let's get
Yeah.
into the Western Legends.
It's a series of 31 stories about African Americans in the West.
Mm-hmm.
These were stories that were told around the campfire, the kitchen table, and the community. So people in the community maybe knew this person, but people outside the community did not know them because most of them weren't literate. Okay, for whatever reason. One, because they weren't allowed to they weren't taught to read and write, or they weren't allowed to read and write because of slavery and issues we had here in the United States. Or whatever, or they were poor, or whatever it was. There were reasons. And so they didn't tell their stories outside of the community. They were oral storytellers, and so lots of oral stories got told and transition and go from person to person. The bad news is there's usually one historian in the family, and it's got all of the stuff. And when something happens to that person, so much can be lost. And so one of the things we tell people is, hey, especially school kids, when we go and talk to schools, we say, go find it at Thanksgiving or Christmas or the next time you're with all your family reunion, go find the oldest person there and ask them to tell you the stories that their parents told them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What stories did they read when they were a child, or what stories did they hear growing up? And capture that information before it's gone. And that's what happened with this book. One of my first clients was the African American Museum in Dallas, Texas. It's the oldest African American museum in the country. And one of their things was the fundraiser was the Texas Black Rodeo. So we started doing rodeo. I guess they started doing in 1985, I think. So they were doing it years before I started working for them in 92 or 90, 91, 92. And so we had these people in their 90s and hundreds that would come and speak to the kids, because we would have like a day before where we had like a Western day, and we'd bring kids in from the schools, and we would have somebody talk to them and speak to them. And so we had these folks, and they made their own dolls. They made their own, toys. They made their own clothes. I mean, they couldn't like jump in the car and drive to Walmart. They had to ride a mule or a wagon like a day and a half to get to town.
Right.
Town wasn't like just over the hill. I mean, and so, they had to use corn, they used everything. They were the first environmentalists. They were the first herbalists. They were the first, all of these things. And we were losing their stories. They started, one of them died, and we said, we got to capture these stories before they're gone. So the first part of the book, as you can see, is black and white. There's a black and white photo. Oh, where am I going? Black and white photo and a story about a person, a real live person that actually lived. And the second part of the story is color, because that's the person that's still living. So it's called Western Legends Yesterday and Today. Because when we go and talk to schools, I mean, kids want to be able to look and see and touch somebody that looks like them. And kids today, especially kids in the city, they don't know. They don't know that there were Black cowboys. They don't know that there were Hispanic cowboys. They don't know that there were Native American or Indian cowboys. They just know what they've seen on TV, which is mostly white cowboys, because studios were controlled and they changed the characters. So a lot of the movies that we've seen, that you and I saw growing up, were played by white actors, were actually Black characters in real life, So the Lone Ranger, for instance, that was based on a story by Bass Reeves, who was a U.S. Marshal out of the Arkansas Territory. And the reason he made so many arrests is because he was Black. and he could go into the Indian Territory because he was black. He wasn't a white man. They weren't suspicious of him, you know, and so he could go in and get and capture people and bring them out because, you know, because he was a black marshal. And he had an Indian partner. Okay. I mean, does that story sound familiar to you? Do you know that story?
That is amazing.
You probably know that story. You know, so you know, the sad thing about history is most people get their history from fiction, not fact. And you know, and so we wanted to tell the real stories, and so that's what we did. We did the first book, and it's like you say, it's about 15, I think, stories from the 1800s. So that's like buffalo soldiers, trappers, you know, pioneer women, even a female horse trainer. First woman to do the mail in Wyoming was a black woman. She basically, you know, saddled up the rig faster than anybody else, and that's how you got the postal. You know, that's how you got the contract with the government to deliver the mail. And you know, she beat out all the men, so she got the route. Now there were some nuns too, you know, pulling for and who were giving the word behind the scene about, you know, getting her a job, trying to get her a job because they'd kicked her out. That, you know, the Monsieur had kicked her out of the, you know, out of the monastery or where the nuns were because she'd gotten a, you know, in a fight with one of the other workers, with a male worker, and they drew down pistols on each other. So, you know, they were trying to help her get a job. But so, you know, so there's those kinds of stories. But see, you know, maybe a few people in that community know her story. Her name was Mary Fields. But other people, her name was Stagecoach Mary Fields because she basically drove the wagon and delivered mail and held off, you know, wolves and bandits and, you know, anybody else that was trying to interrupt the, you know, her delivering the mail from one part of, you know, place to another. But that kind of stuff, rodeo cowboys, Bill Pickett, most everybody knows about Bill Pickett. Bill Pickett was the father of bulldogging, or what we consider steer wrestling, but he was a little short guy from Taylor, Texas, but he worked at the 101 Ranch in Oklahoma, and they're the ones that did a lot of the Wild West shows in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And so, you know, a steer got loose in the crowd, ran up into the crowd screaming and hollering, running for their lives, you know, trying to get away from this steer that, you know, they're pretty big when they get up next to you. You know, Bill rode up in, jumped off, grabbed it by the horns and bit it on the lip and drug it back down the stairs because he had been watching the dogs all these years. And that's what the dogs did. They went into the brush and the cactus and the, you know, and they would bite the steer on the lip and drag them out because that was the most sensitive place. And they would follow them back out, you know, onto the trail. And so, you know, it was an accident, but it became a part of the show after that.
What a great story.
Yeah. And then when rodeo started, of course, it became steer wrestling. And so now in professional rodeos all across the country, TV, anywhere you go, you're going to see steer wrestling. But that was basically started by a black guy named Bill Pickett from Taylor, Texas.
And we don't have to send the steer up into the audience.
Right.
Watch that now, which is a good thing.
And we don't bite them on the lip anymore. We just grab them by the neck and turn them, roll them over. And so their feet are up in the air. And it's a time to be.
That's great.
You know, and so the quickest time wins the money.
Yeah.
You know, so, and then we've got people that are like playing reenactors. And that second part of the story, we got rodeo cowboys, horse trainers. There are people that are training horses today, musicians. I've got a black musician, cowgirl, a black singer named Jay Lee. And she's singing about rodeo and the toughest ride and, you know, bulls and cutting horse dances, you know, was her first big song that she did, which was about a cutting horse, you know, horses cutting out steer, I mean, you know, calves from the thing, you know, from the herd, basically, kind of thing. So we're not only teaching the history, you know, we're teaching about people because these were people that were ordinary people like you and I, and they, because of their choices and actions, they ended up living extraordinary lives. And times were difficult. I mean, you know, one of the stories is about Kathy Williams. She was the only female buffalo soldier. Okay. And the reason we know that is because the military keeps excellent records.
They do indeed.
And, she served for 2 years where they found out she was a woman and they sent her 100 miles away to muster out. But she went back and applied for medical benefits because they actually discharged her on a medical like gout because she was in the infantry. So she
Mhm.
walked instead of cavalry, which was they had 4 infantry units and 2 cavalry units. And cavalry was horseback. You rode on a horse, not really a horse, but a mule or the worst horse. They still got the worst horses in the in the military. But or cavalry, you walked. And so she had foot issues because you were walking in sand and dirt and water and
Mm,
rivers
yeah.
and there weren't medical facilities and they didn't know how to take care of things as much. And so she did actually muster out on a medical leave and she was able, but she signed her name Williams Kathy because she knew they were going to say Private Kathy. Private Kathy, come here,
Oh,
Private
yeah.
Kathy, or Private Kathy, you're assigned to latrine duty today, or you're assigned to, this duty over here. And so she had 2 choices because she was a former slave, the sap of the Civil War. She could work in the house and maybe get some kind of, learning or education, or she could work in the fields. And
Mm,
all her cousins were signing up to join the military because they couldn't find enough soldiers because they all of the white guys had just been in, they'd just been in the war for 4 or 5 years when they thought it was going to be a year and they all
mhm.
wanted to go home. They didn't
Sure.
want to go west and chase Indians and manifest
Yeah.
destiny. They didn't care about that stuff. They wanted to go back to
Mm.
their farm in Virginia or their farm in Georgia or Florida or wherever. And so for the first time, they allowed African Americans or black to serve and, have a weapon. Before that, even though they served in the American Army with Washington, they served in the French and American wars, and they served in all wars that we've had in this country. They weren't legally, allowed to carry a weapon, before 1860,
Wow.
64, 68.
This is some amazing history and
Yeah.
stories that
So,
you're able to share here. And how did you do the research
well,
to
like you say,
find
because
these?
I had a advertising agency, and the museum was my client. I started working with the rodeos, and I
Mhm.
became the liaison between the rodeo and the museum. Because the rodeo founder, he worked for Ford Motor Company, and he'd go out on Monday, and then he'd come back on Friday, so he never could make any of the meetings. So I would meet with him,
Mhm.
later. I mean, we would meet with the staff or with the museum and with everybody, the volunteers, and so we started learning the stories and hearing the stories, and so that's how we captured the stories. But we asked people
Wow.
to send in their names. I mean, we
Mhm.
had some of the stories, but then we asked families to send in their stories. And
How
it's really
wonderful.
funny, because after we published, I got all these people that said, well, we didn't know it was going to be like that. Well, we did because, they said no, they didn't want their story in because they'd been taken advantage. I understand, they were afraid somebody's
Mm,
going to take advantage of them or whatever. And like, well, what you thought we were going to do something unprofessional? I mean, are you kidding me?
yeah.
But anyway, but
Well,
there
these
are
are
supposed to
yeah.
be other versions. So, I've got Europeans, which Europeans came into Galveston Island after the Civil War. They used to come into New York and then they started coming into Galveston because they were going west and that was closer.
Mm,
And so we had the southern and the northern routes, into California. The northern routes, the Donner Party happened. You might know about that because that's up
yeah.
there where you live, where
Mhm.
they were frozen and they began to eat each other because they were frozen in and they didn't have food and they ran out of food and everything else. Well, they started looking for southern routes, and the southern route was founded by a black Native American, half Native American, half black trapper, who was looking for a better way. And then, like
Mhm.
you say, Europeans came into Galveston Island. That's Irish, Swedish, Jewish, Asian. That we even had Asian farmers come into Houston area, and put in rice farms.
Mm,
The Germans and the Swedes and stuff were farmers a lot. So a lot of them settled in central Texas, places like Austin, New Braunfels. And when you go down there, you still see the food and the names and, all of the things related to that. Jewish were more like merchants, they
mhm.
were, they made suits, they made shoes, they made clothes. they migrated up into the Dallas-Fort Worth area and became store owners, up here. But they all came in through Galveston Island after the Civil War, kind of thing. So Native Americans, women, it's a lot harder to find the women's stories. You do have to do more research there. Becoming easier, obviously, with the internet.
Sure.
And with genealogy, I mean, obviously that's a huge boon, for families to figure out their history and how they're connected and things like that. And so like to actually have, would like to do 5 books eventually. And I should have done them by now, but I haven't because I got into helping other people publish.
Yeah.
Well, I don't write enough of my own stuff because I'm helping other people publish now. So about 10 years ago, I started helping other people.
Time and money, right? We all got too much of both.
Well, that's it. That's it for sure. So I appreciate it very much. But if you like cowboys or you like Western history, these are going to be stories you probably haven't heard.
Yeah, and I think it's the
gift for somebody that that likes it, for the cowboy and your cowgirl in your life. A lot of us grew up watching those, and it doesn't matter what age or ethnicity. Those of us over a certain age, let me be honest with you, 50. We grew up watching all those cowboy and Western movies with our parents or with our grandparents or mom or dad. I mean, a lot of us, that's what we did on Saturday morning. We watched those, Saturday morning shows. We watched Rawhide. We watched Bonanza. We watched all those TV shows growing up.
You bet.
That brings back a lot of memories for us. And it doesn't matter if you're black or white or Hispanic, and because that was all that was on. So the black kids or families were watching that. The Hispanic kids or Mexican kids were watching that. The white kids were watching that, because that was what was on. And so we have this mystique, and it's really just astonishing how all over the world, I worked at the rodeo for a couple of years. We have a big rodeo, Mesquite Championship Rodeo here, which was owned by the Gay family, and Donnie Gay was the 8-time world champion bull rider.
Wow.
During 8 years, and throughout probably through the late 70s, 80s, early 90s, in those years, he was the champion, and he was only beat one time by a black cowboy named Charlie Sampson, who was called Pee Wee, who was 5'2" and came out of Watts, California, which is the projects, if you know anything about Watts, California.
Yep.
But there was a ranch not too far that he could walk to, and he would go down there because of the horses originally. And he met Murtis Dykeman, who's one of the most famous bull riders in the world, who was a black bull rider that never won because he always got voted down because he was black. But he was the first one to make the National Professional Rodeo Championship, which is now held in Las Vegas every year in December. It used to be started here in Dallas-Fort Worth, and then it went to Oklahoma City for many years. And then Vegas figured out they could have the show in Las Vegas and take the deadest 10 days of the year and make it the biggest 10 days of the year. So
they know showmanship down there. I'll say they know their audience.
They know exactly what they're doing over there in Las Vegas for sure. Yeah. So now it's a huge deal, and television rights and the whole bit. And it's if you've never been, you should go. Because they have expo with clothing and jewelry and hats and boots and the whole thing. And then they have the rodeos for so many days. And all of the hotels are all decked out. Most of the hotels are halfway booked before they even finish the rodeo this year. Sure. They'll be booked for next year and the following years and stuff. So it's a big deal now. But that's what people know. See, people know the rodeo piece, but they don't know some of these other things. They don't know about Tennessee walking horse trainers. They don't know. A lot of our guys do reenactment. Our people. They play Benjamin Brown, the Buffalo Soldier, or Sergeant Flipper, who was the first African-American to go to West Point, so all of those stories and characters are in the book. And so I encourage you, if you have somebody that loves that, to go check it out.
I encourage you to click on it. It's in the carousel. We've highlighted it, as well as there's a number of other books that Liz has in there. But I click on the book, you can take a look at it. I say add to cart. Look, holiday season's coming.
Right.
Shopping, you can have it delivered right to that person.
That's
Uh,
right. Right
People
to
that
the
you
door.
have, family, friends, there's really nothing better than a book.
Right.
Send them a
And we have
book.
an ebook and a paperback version, so you can buy a gift certificate. If you go over there on the right hand
Yeah,
side, once you click on the link below, you can go to the side and gift somebody, and you just send them they send them an email, and they get an email, and it's got a code. They can go back and put the code in, and so
just download that book, and
yeah,
I think there's some inspiration too, because the characters that you're talking about. So in Western legends, so many of us don't fit into any of those boxes of I'll say, of the 50s and 60s
right,
heroes in those westerns.
yeah,
But when you read through this book, you're going to find none of those people did either. They didn't fit
right,
any of those boxes, and yet they impacted their community, and
hmm,
and certainly our country. And now you can be inspired by their stories here. Liz, thank you for taking time today. I always enjoy talking with you. I learned so much,
you bet. Well,
and
thank you, Scott.
thank
It's
you,
been fun
thank
to
you for
be
the
here,
time.
and
Yeah,
I'm good to come back anytime and talk about all this other
you,
stuff too.
we got,
Oh,
I'm
you
just,
got
I
to
know
talk
there's
about.
there are more books. We got a bunch of them here in the carousel, but I tell you, we'll come back and we'll do this again, Liz.
Okay,
Uh,
sounds
and so
great.
thank you so much. So stand by. I'm going to put you in the green room, and
Okay.
then we'll be right back. We have been talking with Liz Lawless here on Amazon Live. Thank you for tuning in. This link here, you can share that with other people that you think would benefit from being inspired to write their own story. This is absolutely the best time ever to be alive. You want to write a book? You can write a book and tell your story, tell your family history, or uh, there's a lot of options that you can do. Liz has told us a lot of stuff today. So I am just going to say thank you for tuning in, and everyone have a fabulous day.